So in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln he welcomes a visitor to the White House.
Right.
And he allegedly gives this greeting that has just totally echoed through history. He looks at this woman standing in front of him and says, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war."
It is, I mean, it's just a staggering historical anecdote to even consider, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because the woman standing there was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And the book, of course, was Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Published in 1852.
Right.
And it is this towering work of historical fiction, classic literature. I mean, it sold over 300,000 copies in its very first year.
Which is wild.
It is. To put that into perspective for you listening, given the population size of the United States at the time, that is a completely unprecedented scale of distribution. Like, it was everywhere.
It was inescapable.
Yeah. So today we're doing a deep dive into the source material that basically changed American history, extracting the hidden mechanics of how Stowe used fiction as a weapon. This is a summary review of Uncle Tom's Cabin. We're going to walk through what the book covers, its chapters, key arguments, and major examples, so you can follow the big picture without getting bogged down in analysis.
And you're experiencing a unique two-voice AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM, for deeper, more dynamic book analysis, presented by Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.
So to understand the explosive impact of this novel, we really have to look at the legal framework of the moment it was published, don't we?
We do. The writing of this book was triggered directly by the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850.
Okay.
And the narrative essentially traces the divergent paths of enslaved people who belonged to the Shelby farm in Kentucky. It serves as this dramatic reality check on the entire institution of slavery.
Right, and that Fugitive Slave Act is so crucial here because it wasn't just like a political disagreement happening in the halls of Congress.
No, not at all.
This act legally compelled citizens of free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people.
Right, which changed everything.
Exactly. If you lived in Massachusetts or Ohio and you refused to help catch a fugitive or, if you offered them food or shelter,
you faced severe criminal penalties.
Massive fines, imprisonment. It essentially drafted the entire northern population into acting as an extension of the southern slave-catching system.
And that legal mechanism completely destroyed the illusion of distance.
Right.
Because before 1850, a lot of Northerners preferred to just view slavery as, a localized Southern problem.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. They could turn a blind eye. But the new law forced the issue right onto their own doorsteps, making them legally complicit. So Stowe's motivation was to basically grab the complacent Northern reader by the shoulders.
And shake them.
Yeah, and force them to look at the human reality of the system they were now legally bound to uphold.
And that human reality hits us, immediately in the opening chapters.
It really does.
Because the inciting incident of the entire narrative, it doesn't start with some dramatic act of violence. It starts with a mundane financial crisis.
Right. A very common scenario.
We have Mr. Shelby, a Kentucky farmer, and he's facing imminent financial ruin. So, to settle his mounting debts, he makes this calculated business decision to sell 2 of his enslaved people to a trader named Haley.
And the 2 he chooses are
his faithful, deeply religious servant, Uncle Tom, and a little boy named Harry, who is the young son of a woman named Eliza.
Yeah. And Stowe is showing you right away how the economic machinery of slavery fundamentally overrides any personal morality or affection.
Right.
Because Mr. Shelby doesn't necessarily want to sell Tom or Harry. He considers himself a benevolent master.
Right. Air quotes around benevolent.
Exactly. But he is a businessman in debt, and in this system, human beings are liquid assets. We see the horrific human cost of this transaction through the reactions on the farm, especially Mrs. Shelby.
She is absolutely horrified.
Oh, she points out the glaring hypocrisy of their position immediately.
And this is where I really struggle, right? I struggle to understand how the Shelbys can think of themselves as good Christians while casually finalizing the sale of a child.
Yeah.
It feels like the ultimate form of cognitive dissonance. They sit in their parlor talking about Christian duty, and out back they are literally shattering a family for cash.
And that cognitive dissonance is exactly what Stowe is putting under the microscope for the reader. I mean, Mrs. Shelby has spent years instructing their enslaved workers in Christian family values.
Right.
She emphasized the sacred duties of parent and child, the unbreakable bond of husband and wife. And then upon learning of the sale, she basically asks her husband how she can ever hold her head up again.
Wow.
Because for the sake of paltry financial gain, they are tearing apart the very families they promised to protect. The system makes it impossible to be both a slaveholder and a practicing Christian.
Because the ledger always
The
wins.
ledger always wins.
And then devastation of that ledger becomes intensely personal in this really striking conversation between Eliza and her husband, George Harris.
Yes, George's situation is heartbreaking.
George describes his daily existence as just a miserable drudge under a cruel, petty master on a neighboring farm. He tells Eliza that his life is burning out of him, bitter as wormwood, and he outright states that he wishes he had never been born.
Which is just a portrait of complete systemic dehumanization. George is highly intelligent. He creates these mechanical inventions.
Right, he's brilliant.
But his master actively suppresses all of that out of pure spite. And his despair drives him toward this really dangerous, defiant escape. He realizes the system will crush him entirely if he stays.
And then Eliza discovers that her son, little Harry, is going to be sold the very next morning.
Right, so she takes a completely different path.
Yeah, she doesn't have time to plan an escape like George. She just acts on pure, terrified maternal instinct.
She takes little Harry in her arms and makes this desperate, panicked run for the dangerously icy Ohio River.
And she literally leaps across floating cakes of ice to escape the slave catchers who are right on her heels.
It is one of the most famous scenes in all of American literature.
It's so visceral, and she eventually finds her way to this calm, spotless Quaker settlement, which, you know, that pristine, peaceful environment of the Quaker home stands in deliberate, sharp contrast to the absolute chaos and violence of her enslavement.
Right, because the Quakers operate completely outside the prevailing legal framework. They follow a higher moral law. Their settlement is clean, orderly, and deeply humanizing. And Stowe deliberately contrasts the warmth of human life with the cold, mechanical nature of commerce throughout all these opening chapters.
Okay, wait, I want to push back on that a bit. Because on the Shelby farm, we get these rich domestic scenes before the sale, right?
We do, yeah.
And Chloe is cooking with intense pride in her cabin, treating her space like a formal drawing room. Young Master George is carefully teaching Tom how to write the letter G on a slate. Those warm scenes on the farm really struck me, but they almost feel like a trap. It reminds me of looking at like a sterile corporate restructuring spreadsheet today where thousands of employee layoffs are just reduced to anonymous line items to balance a budget.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. And the trader, Haley, operates exactly like that spreadsheet. He literally calculates human worth in a leather ledger. He evaluates a human being by length, breadth, and height.
It's chilling.
And when he sees Eliza's crushing, world-ending grief over losing her child, he clinically dismisses it as just a sweat that will eventually pass.
And that corporate spreadsheet analogy captures the precise mechanism at work here. Because you're right, the warmth of the Shelby farm is a dangerous illusion.
Right.
Stowe is arguing that no amount of paternalistic kindness from the Shelbys can protect Tom or Harry from the brutal legal reality of being property. The institution of slavery ultimately renders all human connections subordinate to the market.
So Haley's cold calculation is the actual truth of the matter.
Exactly. It's the unvarnished reality of the system. The law class is breathing, immortal human beings with bundles and boxes.
So while George and Eliza physically fight for their freedom and run, Tom takes a completely different route.
He does.
He submits to his sale. And he does this specifically to protect the rest of the Shelby slaves. Because if he runs, Mr. Shelby will be forced to sell several other families to cover the debt.
So Tom sacrifices himself.
He really does. He is placed on a boat in heavy irons, heading down the river toward the deep south.
And that journey down the Mississippi River is a descent into a much darker reality of the slave trade.
Yeah.
As Tom moves further away from his wife and children, facing this utterly unknown and terrifying future, he finds his only refuge in his faith.
He's sitting among the cotton bales, just reading his heavily marked Bible.
Yeah, right. And because he learned to read late in life, he reads slowly, tracing out the words with his finger.
Yeah.
He anchors himself in verses like, "Let not your heart be troubled."
He focuses entirely on the spiritual realm because the physical world has stripped him of absolutely everything else.
Yeah.
This is Mindful Moments, where we turn powerful books into clear, rational conversations for readers, students, and educators.
So Tom's journey down the river eventually brings him to New Orleans.
Right, and his life intersects with a new household that serves a very specific thematic purpose. He meets his new owners, the St. Clairs.
And the St. Clair household is this brilliantly constructed microcosm that Stowe uses to explore the hypocrisy of both the North and the South.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, you have the relaxed, aristocratic Augustine St. Clair. You have his pure, angelic daughter, Eva, who forms an immediate bond with Tom. And then you have his northern cousin, Miss Ophelia, who has come down from Vermont to manage the sprawling estate.
And Miss Ophelia is just a fascinating character study.
She really is.
Because she represents mainstream Northern abolitionist sentiment of the era. Like, she believes firmly and morally that slavery is a sin. She will argue against it all day long.
Right.
Yet when she is actually around Black people, she physically recoils. She doesn't want them touching her or her belongings. And St. Clair immediately sees this prejudice and points out the glaring contradiction.
And St. Clair's observation is piercing. He notes that Northern custom allows people to loathe the enslaved like a snake or a toad, yet remain fiercely indignant at their wrongs from a safe distance.
No.
Yeah, he accuses Northerners like Ophelia of basically wanting to send the enslaved back to Africa out of sight and smell, rather than actually doing the hard work of interacting with them as equals or integrating them into society.
It is a massive indictment of abstract morality that refuses to get its hands dirty.
Exactly.
But wait, St. Clair isn't exactly standing on the moral high ground here either.
No, definitely not.
He is incredibly perceptive. He admits to Ophelia that slavery is simply the right of the strongest. He complains that the necessity of drivers and overseers and managing humans like horned cattle is insufferably disgusting to him.
Right. He sees the ugly truth.
He clearly sees the evil of the system. So why on earth does a man who sees the moral rot so clearly continue to actively participate in it?
Because the psychology of St. Clair is basically the tragedy of inherited power.
Okay.
He understands the moral bankruptcy of slavery perfectly well. He completely rejects the superficial religious arguments his wife Marie uses to justify owning people.
Yeah.
But his intellectual clarity never translates into moral action because he is paralyzed by his own comfort.
Ah, right.
He tells Ophelia that he was born an aristocrat. He relies on the immense luxury and ease the system provides him. He embodies a society that knows it is committing a profound wrong, but absolutely refuses to accept the inconvenience or financial loss required to make it right.
That's heavy, and we see the tension between those intellectual ideas and actual human connection play out really vividly with the education of the children in the household.
We do, specifically with Topsy.
Right, Miss Ophelia decides to take on the project of educating this young, severely neglected, enslaved child named Topsy. And Ophelia applies these rigid, mechanical New England methods to the task.
Which is just a recipe for disaster.
Total disaster. She uses rote memorization of the catechism, strict sewing lessons, and threatens whipping when Topsy lies.
And the result is a complete failure.
Oh.
Topsy rejects the instruction entirely. Because Ophelia approaches Topsy not as a traumatized human child requiring nurture, but as a project to be managed.
Right.
The mechanical application of rules does absolutely nothing to reach a child who has only ever known violence and commodification.
She doesn't feel love.
Exactly. Topsy understands she is still viewed as a subordinate creature, so she simply leans into the label they force upon her, famously declaring, "I so wicked."
It is such a heartbreaking defense mechanism.
It really is.
Because if the world tells you that you are fundamentally bad and offers no love to prove otherwise, you just embrace the wickedness as your identity.
Yeah.
But that dynamic is immediately contrasted with the pure spiritual bond between Eva, St. Clair's daughter, and Tom. Eva sits with Tom and reads the book of Revelation to him.
Right.
They share this deep, transcendent, emotional connection to the text.
And St. Clair watches this dynamic unfold, and he actually laments his own lack of faith. He looks at Tom's unwavering integrity and calls him a moral miracle.
A moral miracle.
Yeah, because Tom remains honest, gentle, and faithful in a system that is fundamentally built on theft, deception, and brutality. St. Clair recognizes that Tom's goodness is inexplicable given the environment that actively seeks to crush his spirit.
But Stowe uses this very relationship to highlight a terrifying underlying reality, doesn't she?
She does, the fragility of good masters.
Right, because no matter how kind a master like St. Clair might be or how pure the love of Eva is, the enslaved individuals are entirely at the mercy of fate.
Complete.
Eva's health is incredibly delicate, and St. Clair's protection of Tom is only as durable as his own life.
And the narrative explicitly foreshadows tragedy here to prove a legal point. When a benevolent master dies, the enslaved person is instantly thrown back into the violent machinery of the open market.
With zero safety net.
The law offers absolutely no protection. A slave's life is shielded by nothing more than the temporary mood or lifespan of the person who holds the deed. And Stowe includes a note explaining that Tom's eventual destination is the brutal plantation of Simon Legree.
And Legree is the terrifying logical conclusion of the system.
He is the monster at the end of the line.
He's described as having a fist like a blacksmith's hammer. He operates his remote plantation with complete impunity, working his enslaved laborers to death and simply buying more.
Right.
He represents the raw, unregulated violence of total ownership.
And when Tom falls into Legree's hands, the facade of paternalistic slavery is stripped away entirely. Legree demands that Tom whip a fellow enslaved woman.
Which Tom refuses to do.
Exactly. When Tom refuses on moral and religious grounds, Legree subjects him to fatal beatings. And Legree can beat a man to death on his property, and the legal system looks away.
Because the law considers it nothing more than the destruction of a piece of equipment.
Exactly. Tom achieves martyrdom, maintaining his faith and his morals centered to his dying breath. But his death is a stark indictment of a system that allows such unchecked tyranny.
And as we reach the final chapters of the book, Stowe's narrative structure changes entirely. She breaks the fourth wall.
She steps right out of the story.
She addresses the reader directly. She insists that the horrific incidents you just read about, Eliza's desperate crossing of the ice, the heartbreaking stories of families torn apart at auction, Tom's martyrdom, they are not mere fiction. They are based on authentic, verifiable events.
She transforms the novel from melodrama into actual reportage.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to her core motivation, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850.
Right, the law that started it all.
By presenting the undeniable humanity of George, Eliza, and Tom over hundreds of pages, she forces the Northern reader to realize what compliance with that law actually means.
It's not abstract anymore.
No, it means actively participating in the destruction of those families. It means sending human beings back to the blacksmith hammer fists of men like Simon Legree.
Just imagine you're a reader in Massachusetts or Vermont in 1852. You've just finished crying over the death of Uncle Tom.
Right.
And then the author turns to you on the final page, calls out the farmers of your state and the sailors of Maine, and asks you point blank, is this a system you are willing to uphold?
It's a direct challenge.
She demands to know what you are going to do when a fugitive knocks on your door. Are you going to follow the law and send them back to the Legrees of the world, or are you going to follow your conscience?
Stowe strips away the illusion of distance. Passivity is no longer an option because the legislation requires active participation. The fiction becomes a mirror reflecting the reader's own moral culpability.
Wow.
She is asking the American public to evaluate the state of their own soul in the face of this brutal legislation.
So to synthesize the overarching theme of the text, Uncle Tom's Cabin basically functions as an exhaustive, meticulous map of the institution of slavery. Stowe demonstrates how the system inherently corrupts the master, destroys families, and forces individuals into impossible moral choices.
It leaves no one untouched.
Right. And while George Harris and his family ultimately escape the continent entirely, relocating to Liberia in Africa, Stowe refuses to offer a neat, comfortable resolution for the nation itself.
She leaves the heavy moral burden squarely on the shoulders of the American public. The narrative argues that a system built on treating humans as commodities cannot be reformed by kind masters. It must be entirely eradicated.
Click the link on screen for the related episodes, essential insights, summary, analysis, critique, or deep critique. Subscribe, share, think rationally. See the many genre-based books at mindful moments and nourish your mind on the go.
And just to leave you with a final thought to ponder, Stowe wrote this book because a new law forced everyday citizens to become complicit in a brutal system they preferred to ignore. Looking at our world today, in what ways do we still turn a blind eye to the human cost of the systems that provide our daily conveniences? When the supply chains that bring goods to our doorsteps rely on unseen suffering, what would it take for us to finally pay attention? Do we require a visceral story to make us see the invisible lines of commerce behind our comforts?
That is a powerful question.
Perhaps that enduring challenge to our own complacency is the truest legacy of the little woman who wrote the book that started a great war.